It is reasonable that these prices continued into the early years of Chanda Sudamaraja's reign. The temporary cessation of taxation during the first 3 years of Chanda Sudamaraja's reign from 1652 to 1655 suggests that during these years extraordinary measures were needed to revive the Arakanese economy. After 1684, peace with Banten enabled the VOC to obtain rice from sources closer to Batavia. This meant Arakanese rice was not needed anymore to secure a steady food supply for Batavia and the Spice Islands. Now that we have very briefly touched the functioning and the development of trade, it is time to assess the relative importance of the control over southeastern Bengal in terms of land revenue with Arakanese income from trade. The question, I think, is essentially how important a source of revenues were Arakan's Bengal dominions in comparison to the income of trade. The Mughal estimates of the Bengal revenues provide a clear illustration of the wealth of southeastern Bengal. The first revenue settlement of Bengal made by Todar Mal in 1582 shows the areas which we now know to have been the battlefield between the Arakanese and the Mughals. They yielded an estimated 2 million rupees, which is about 30% of all Bengal revenues. This would include sarkars that were under Arakanese control, like Hitli, Jessore, Bakla and the Dhaka area, and of course Chittagong. Chittagong alone accounted for a revenue of about 300,000 rupees, while the Dhaka area was rated about 1 million rupees. The second revenue settlement of Bengal is the 1658 assessment made on orders of Shah Shuja. If we are to follow Richard Eaton, who calculated on average a 100% increase in the revenues of southeastern Bengal between 1582 to 1658, the southeastern Bengal revenues would have grown to about 5 million rupees in the middle of the 17th century. Although the underlying figures are sometimes difficult to interpret, it's clear that southeastern Bengal was an important economic center already in the late 16th century, certainly worth the effort of conquering. In the 1658 settlement, several new sarkars are also added to Todar Mal's list. Most of them are most likely recently conquered areas. It would, however, be wrong to assume that the majority of these revenues had all flowed into Arakanese coffers during the first half of the 17th century. But it is also wrong to assume that because areas such as Chittagong were included in Mughal revenue accounts since 1582, these areas were actually controlled by the Mughals. On the basis of the reconstruction of the Arakanese-Mughal conflict in my dissertation, we can, however, now conclude that a large part of southeastern Bengal revenues flowed into Arakanese coffers before the middle of the 17th century. This corroborates van der Helm's mid-17th century statement quoted earlier, when he argued that the income from Bengal taxes was the most important source of revenue for the Arakanese treasury. Earlier in the 17th century, the Dutch chief on the Coromandel coast wrote to the VOC's Governor-General in Batavia that Bengal was of considerable economic importance to the Arakanese. British and Mughal revenue settlements of the Chittagong area later clearly point to the fact that regular land revenue collection was an important element of Arakanese control over this part of Bengal. The fact that when the British took control over Chittagong, the land revenue administration was still based on Arakanese standards and Arakanese practices provides clear evidence that revenue extraction from Bengal was organized along the same lines as it was in Arakan itself. In Chittagong, land was measured in Magi Kani. Land surveys were made according to Arakanese methods. No maps were used, but the measurements were recorded in a field book. The Mughals, moreover, used the Arakanese era in fiscal matters. This would lead to the conclusion that the Mughals probably ratified existing estates which had already been measured by the Arakanese earlier. This is confirmed by the fact that the majority of local zamindars reportedly settled in Chittagong from the middle of the 16th century. when the land was first occupied by the Arakanese. From this evidence, we may conclude that regular land rent collection formed part and parcel of Arakanese administration in southeastern Bengal. As quoted earlier, Talish in the Fatiha Ibria stated that regular accounts of the Bengal revenue with regards to the Sarkars to the northwest of Chittagong were kept by the Portuguese operating under Arakanese control from Chittagong. To conclude, the question that we should ask ourselves now is what share of official income actually depended on agrarian management and what share was derived from trade. Taxes on trade in Arakan should be estimated at most at 10%. Of this tax, 4% went to the king's officials and 6% immediately to the king. Between 1636 and 1644, VOC return cargoes from Arakan were valued at about 12,000 to 31,000 guilders each year. This suggests a tax income from trade with the Dutch probably amounted between 800 or 2,500 tanka per year. And the Dutch were certainly the largest traders in Arakan, accounting for the majority of the cargo entering and leaving the country. If we speculate, we could assume that tax on trade levied on all other traders would probably not amount to much more than taxes levied on the VOC trade as a whole. This would give a tentative figure for income from tax on trade of about 5,000 tanka a year. Then again, traders of course also brought gifts, which can also be considered as royal revenues from trade. Taken together, taxes and gifts, we could calculate, would probably not amount to more than 10,000 tanka on a yearly basis. Tax income from trade in Chittagong is difficult to assess. For the early 17th century, we know that in 1616 the Arakanese king Mankamau told the Dutch that during the early years of the 17th century, Manuel de Matos, as I've stated earlier, gained a tax revenue at the Yanga of about 20,000 tanka. And I would suggest that these incomes would not have grown spectacularly during the 17th century. If we are now to compare royal income from trade with those from land revenue, this means incomes from trade paled into insignificance, even if only Chittagonian land revenue, which is estimated between what I said 250,000 and 500,000 rupees, is considered, which, as was argued earlier, certainly does not justice to the extent of Arakan control over Bengal. If we add income from the slave trade as another form of revenues, the importance of Bengal for Arakan can hardly be underestimated. The establishment of Arakanese control over Chittagong from the 16th century onwards provided Arakanese kings with a significant source of revenue which enabled them to expand Arakanese royal power across the Arakan-Bengal continuum. Arakan thrived because the Arakanese kings were able to exploit the riches of Bengal from the strategic fortress at Chittagong. These riches consisted of its land revenue, taxes from trade, and human resources. The withering of Arakanese control in southeastern Bengal after 1638 meant that the income from land revenue decreased. From the mid-1640s, the Arakanese economy declined. The large-scale trade in slaves slowly died out during this period. VOC demand for Arakanese rice also almost disappeared when the Dutch found other and more easily accessible sources. The departure of the VOC from Arakan had its impact on other merchants. Larger merchants from Coromandel followed the Dutch example and stopped their businesses in Arakan. With the disappearance of the Bengal revenues and the departure of large traders, Arakanese markets dried up. Arakanese royal power that had depended upon the redistribution of the considerable wealth generated by the control over Bengal and taxes from trade was now challenged from within. The country subsequently was torn apart by a civil war at the end of the 17th century. This brings me to the end of my talk to you. I have tried to give a brief glimpse of Arakanese history during the rule of King theory of the Dhamma-Raja, and the importance of control over Bengal for the expansion of the Arakan state in the 16th and 17th centuries. If you want to learn more about this episode, you can download my dissertation from the website of Leiden University Library for free. Next slide, please. And I would like to conclude to say thank you to you all. Jesu Tambare. The first question is, in 1640 there were a large number of Dutch children with Arakanese mothers. There was a large community of Portuguese, there was a large Muslim. So it was a very diverse city, I think, already in that period. And that was probably also one of its strengths. But people did not identify themselves in the sources. I never came across this term. And people also identified themselves in other ways. So, this question, the name of Arakan was taken from an original Pali word. I am not a Pali scholar, so I cannot give any qualified answer on this. On this Dutch map, you see the Dutch corruption of Rakhine. It's called Arakan here, and it's the A is not here yet. It's not Arakan, but it's Rakhine. In later Dutch maps, Rakhine is corrupted to Arakan, but here it's still Rakhine. If there were Muslim kings in Arakan, no, I haven't come across in my research on the 17th century. There was no Muslim kings. As I just explained, had Muslim titles sometimes to illustrate their dominion in areas of Bengal. They used different names in different areas, but especially in the sources I used, I did not find any evidence for this. There were, of course, enough Muslims in Arakan, but the kings, we can see in the Dutch sources that they are building stupas, they are spending money on making large Buddha statues and giving alms to the monks. And the Dutch record, as the Dutch usually do, how much money they spend on each statue. Yeah.
May I just try to give an answer to the question of Venerable Pandita who asked about, we are now, with my assistant Dominion, finishing the catalogue of all Rakhine Dosa. In one manuscript in Sri Lanka, then the country is called Rakangapura, which seems to be made up by the monks who visited from there, who went back, and they write it in Sinhalese language, and they use it Rakangapura. So you have different forms, but as far as the evidence is concerned, in the hard proof of stone inscriptions, Josa, you have the word Rakha referring to the king there and Rakhine in the 15th century. Yes, again, the questions why Rakhine kings used different languages for their titles. I mean, just think about the British colonial period. Sometimes Myanmar people, they used also English name. And why? Because sometimes it's easier to make yourself understood. Sometimes we refer to a country a different way that other people refer to the country. Take Greece. By the Greek, they call their own country Hellas, not Greece. But the Romans, they used that word. Now, I don't get into talking about Myanmar or Burma. What term you use? That's another question for another seminar. But it is quite easy to understand that Rakhine kings, because the population that they controlled, and Stephan just explained about how important was the control over Chittagong area, Southeast Bengal, for the economy, for their power. So they are using terms. And please, you don't forget, they're using Sanskrit as well. There's a Hindu population there. There are some Muslim population in a specific area in Southeast Bengal, definitely, and we have Buddhist population. So it's not surprising that you use different labels to advertise yourself. Coins, where we find these titles, because they are mainly the coins, there's not much else. On the coins, money is always like promoting sovereign power. That's why on every money in the world we have expression of sovereign power of the state. State leaders, kings, national monuments, it's always reflecting sovereign power. So you use different languages for different people because you're talking to different people. That's, I think, the answer that we should bear in mind with that. It does not mean that somebody has this identity. You don't claim the identity, but money, coins are expressing the way that the message that you give to the people, in a way. So now, as I said at the beginning, the issue of identity is such a hot topic. And what belongs to our own identity? What we see nowadays, and that's among the feeling of the people in Myanmar, not only Rakhine, but many other ethnic groups as well, is that you try to define closely and more exclusively your own identity. It is quite clear that Rakhine have put a strong focus on their Buddhist identity. But historians like ourselves, we keep on telling you that in the past it is very complex. There are many different kinds of people there. And we have a problem, to understand sometimes the different identities. It doesn't mean like we need to find this out. Sometimes we cannot because we don't have the evidence. The question here, do you accept that Bengal, Chittagong and Rakhine are very closely linked, social, economy, political and regional, for centuries back? When people live together, like today we have the situation in Myanmar, what do we see? When people of different identity live together, they feel very strongly about their own identity. Isn't it true? And since a very long time, and it goes back into history. So this is a kind of a fact. But does not say very much about how the relationship developed. One of my colleagues who knows a lot about this area now is a French scholar who is teaching Bengali language at Chicago University, Thibaut Dubert. I've been working a lot with him and discussing a lot with him. He's been studying the Bengali poetry of Alaol, a Bengali Muslim who lived at the court of Mao. And when he analyzed that literature, he could say very clearly that relationship between community have been developing. Sometimes more tolerance and more understanding, sometimes not. So what I say is these things have been developing over the centuries. We should sometimes beware of comparing today, the problems of today, with the situation before. History is very interesting, but it doesn't solve the problems of today. I've been keeping on telling that again and again. The problems of today have to be solved with the means of today. History does not help us to solve the problem, but history can teach us many things.